Remember that an allele is a type of gene. You have two copies of all of your genes, one from your mom and one from your dad. So let's talk about a gene where big B represents brown hair and little b represents blonde hair. If a person has two copies of big B's or the genotype big B, that person will have brown hair. Why? Because they have two copies of the allele for brown hair. They don't have nothing else to express. If a person has two copies of little b's or the genotype little b, that person will have blonde hair. Why? Because they have two copies of the allele for blonde hair. Now, if a person inherits one copy of a big B and one copy of a little b, they have the genotype big B, little b. That person will have brown hair. Why? Because brown hair, represented by big B, is dominant over blonde hair, represented by little b. When talking about Mendelian genetics, big letters like big B represent dominant alleles. Little letters like little b represent recessive alleles. When a person inherits one dominant allele and one recessive allele, like a person with the genotype big B, little b, the dominant allele big B will dominate the phenotype that is expressed. Therefore, the person will have the phenotype of brown hair. Remember that phenotype is a description of the physical characteristics that you have, like brown hair or blonde hair. Genotype is a description of the genes you have, like having big B, or big B, little b, or little b, little b. A heterozygote is an organism with two different alleles for a specific gene. For example, an organism with a genotype big B, little b. Big B is different from little b. Two different alleles mean this organism is a heterozygote for this gene. Other genes may use other letters, so recognize that if an organism has a genotype big A, big H, big T, big R, and so on, these are all examples of heterozygotes for these genes. A homozygote is an organism with two of the same alleles for a specific gene. For example, an organism with a genotype big B. The two alleles are the same. Therefore, the organism is homozygous for this gene. Wait, but an organism can also be little b. Isn't this also a homozygote? Yes, these are both examples of homozygotes. To differentiate them, we call an organism with the genotype big B homozygous dominant because of the dominant big B's. An organism with the genotype little b, we call homozygous recessive because of the recessive little b's. And again, other genes can use other letter abbreviations. So recognize that the genotypes big A, big H, big T, big R, and so on are examples for homozygous dominant genotypes. And recognize that the genotypes little a, little h, little t, little r, and so on are examples for homozygous recessive genotypes. A monohybrid cross is a cross between organisms that differ in one character. So let's test the character for hair color, where big B represents the dominant allele for brown hair and little b represents the recessive allele for blonde hair. I ask you to determine the genotypic and phenotypic ratio of the offspring from parents with the genotypes big B and little b. This is when you use a Punnett square. So draw a square and divide it into 4 equal squares. Write one parent's genotype on top and the other parent's genotype on the left. Bring one of each allele at the top into the empty boxes below it. Bring one of each allele on the left into the empty boxes to the right. And there you go. You just created your first Punnett square. Now let's talk about what that means. The 4 genotypes that you just filled represent the 4 possible combinations that can result in the offspring of those two parents. Notice that they're all the same. 4 of the genotype big B, little b. This is your genotypic ratio. It's not much of a ratio because there are no other genotypes. You can also report this ratio as a fraction or a percentage. If 4 out of 4 of the resulting combinations are big B, little b, then 100% of the offspring will have the genotype big B, little b. 100% of the offspring will be heterozygotes. Now, write down the phenotypes for the resulting genotypes. A big B, little b genotype will have brown hair as the phenotype. Remember that big B for brown hair is dominant over little b for blonde hair. 4 big B, little b individuals means that 4 out of 4 offspring will likely have brown hair. 100% of the offspring will likely have brown hair. Let's try another. Determine the genotypic and phenotypic ratio of offspring that result from parents with the genotypes big B, little b, and big B, little b. Feel free to pause here and try it out on your own. So draw a square and divide it into 4 equal squares. Write one parent's genotype on the top and one parent's genotype on the left. Bring one of each allele at the top down into the empty boxes below it. Bring one of each allele on the left into the empty boxes to the right. The 4 genotypes that you just filled represent the 4 possible combinations that can result in the offspring of those 2 parents. And notice that there are different genotypes this time. List out how many of each genotype you notice. I see 1 big B, 2 big B, little b, and 1 little b. This is your genotypic ratio, 1 to 2 to 1. 1 homozygous dominant individual, 2 heterozygotes, and 1 homozygous recessive individual. You can also report this ratio as a fraction or percentage. 1 out of 4 offspring will have the genotype big B. This means there is a 25% chance that the offspring will have the genotype big B. 2 out of 4 offspring will be big B, little b. There is a 50% probability that offspring will have the genotype big B, little b. 1 out of 4 offspring will have the genotype little b. There is a 25% chance that offspring will have the genotype little b. Now, write down the phenotypes for the resulting genotypes. A big B genotype will have brown hair as the phenotype. A big B, little b genotype will also have brown hair as the phenotype. And the little b genotype will have blonde hair as the phenotype. Your phenotypic ratio is 3 brown hair to 1 blonde hair, or 3 to 1. This means that 3 out of 4 offspring will have brown hair, and there is a 75% chance that the offspring will have brown hair. 1 out of 4 offspring will have blonde hair. There is a 25% chance that the offspring will have blonde hair. Notice I use words like chance and probability. A monohybrid cross only tells you the likelihood that a gene is or is not passed. These parents could still produce 4 children that have brown hair. There is simply a 75% chance that the child will have brown hair every time a child is made. So try these crosses for practice.